welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, spying on nonviolent protesters, not just a thing of the past. We talk with David Rocah, staff attorney for the ACLU of Maryland, about the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Maryland State Police. Should local police report arrested immigrants to federal authorities for possible deportation? It's a growing trend that concerns Michelle Mendez of the immigration rights group CASA of Maryland. You, taxpayer, have invested heavily in the recovery of our banking system, but are banks investing in us? Washington Independent reporter Mary Kane joins us to talk about banks, property deeds, and bad deeds. Also, the 9th annual Muslim Women in the Arts exhibit opens in April. We've got poetry by Thomas Sayers Ellis and Angie Chuang, and Grammy Whammy winner John Carroll.
Wander on the front porch, nobody knows I'm a little down.
On the Coffee House. Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. We now know that the Maryland State Police spied on a variety of activists whom it suspected of terrorism and shared its suspicions with the Federal Department of Homeland Security. DHS then tracked an anti-war group's plans for a protest. This happened under the administrations of former Governor Bob Ehrlich and George W. Bush. Neither the federal nor the state surveillance, which lasted 14 months, turned up any criminal activity by the protest groups. Now policymakers are debating how to prevent this sort of unfounded surveillance from recurring. And with us to discuss the proposal of Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley and the stronger medicine prescribed by certain state legislators is David Rocah, staff attorney for the ACLU of Maryland. David, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks very much for having me.
How did we first learn about this surveillance by the Maryland State Police?
We had filed a Maryland Public Information Act request.
We being ACLU.
We being the ACLU of Maryland back in 2006. And after repeated denials by the state police they acknowledged that they had responsive documents, but they refused to turn them over. And after going back and forth with them for a while, we finally sued them under the Public Information Act, the state open records law. And 2 weeks after we sued them, they turned over to us 43 pages of surveillance logs and database printouts showing this quite incredible 14-month campaign of covert infiltration of various anti-death penalty and peace groups in Maryland. And that's what broke the story. Since then, we've filed a whole new round of Public Information Act requests back in September of last year. And from those requests, which were filed on behalf of 32 different activist organizations and more than 250 people affiliated with those organizations, we have now learned that the state police, in fact, had files on 20 of those groups. And we also learned from hearings held in the state Senate. 20
anti-death penalty and peace groups?
No, a whole variety of groups. Environmental groups, groups opposed to the BGE rate hikes, CASA of Maryland, one of your later guests, Equality Maryland, the statewide LGBT group. You name it, if there was a political cause in Maryland and there was a group that was organizing demonstrations, they seem to have been on the state police radar screen and are in the state police criminal intelligence database.
Well, doesn't it make sense? Doesn't it make sense post 9/11 that state police, federal police should be monitoring groups that potentially pose some kind of harm to the public order?
Well, it's fine in theory to say that the state police should monitor groups that pose a potential of harm. What isn't fine is to say that peaceful political protest groups pose that risk of harm. The question is, what should the standard be for police surveillance of groups, for entering information into police criminal intelligence dossiers about groups? The federal regulations say that standard should be reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal behavior. That's a standard that police are very familiar with. It's used in other law enforcement contexts, and that's the standard that we have pushed for in the bill that you referenced that's being
and we'll come back
sponsored
to that.
by a number of state legislators.
And we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. I'm wondering, though, then police superintendent in Maryland, Tim Hutchins, was the person in charge when this spying was going on, right?
Well, I do want to be clear. The 14-month period that you refer to is the 14 months that was covered by that initial set of documents that we got. What we've learned in subsequent, from the responses to our subsequent Public Information Act requests, is that that 14-month period is not the full scope of the program, both in terms of who was targeted and in terms of when the spying happened. So
Is it that it happened earlier or
both.
after? Both.
Both. So we see files that were created earlier than that 14-month period. The 14-month period that we're referring to was the period covered by those files, March of '05 to May of '06. But we have now files that were opened in January and February of '05, and we have files that were opened as late as July of '07.
This would be all during the administration of Governor Bob Ehrlich, or
no,
going into the O'Malley
for
administration?
example, a very small number of files were opened during the O'Malley administration.
Now,
the vast majority, overwhelming majority, were during the Ehrlich administration.
and former Governor Ehrlich maintains that he knew nothing of this. How plausible is that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the point, I think, is not whether Governor Ehrlich knew or didn't know. I don't think there's really evidence, with one exception. In fact, the exception is someone I think you know well, CCAN, Mike Tidwell. There is evidence there.
Who is a host of this program.
Right, of what looks like political retribution, and I'll tell that anecdote. But for the most part, there doesn't appear to be evidence that this was politically directed, in the sense of Ehrlich identifying his political enemies and sicking the Maryland State Police on them. In some ways, I think it's more chilling, because what it was a culture of better safe than sorry. A pervasive culture in the state police that it didn't even occur to them that what they were doing was wrong or problematic in any way. So from their perspective, they viewed demonstrating, they viewed people exercising their First Amendment rights, which is of course the whole reason we have a First Amendment in this country, as somehow inherently dangerous, inherently potentially disruptive of public order, and thought that because of that, they needed to keep dossiers on any group that might do it in order to somehow be able to predict what they might do.
Now, how did the Department of Homeland Security, the federal government, get involved in this?
Well, that's still very mysterious. One of the files that we obtained through our September MPIA request revealed that the Department of Homeland Security actually contacted the MSP and said there was going to be a demonstration by DAWN, the DC Anti-War Network, a peaceful political protest group in the DC area and suburbs, at a military recruiting station in Tacoma Park. And this is something that one of DAWN's primary activities was holding demonstrations outside of military recruiting stations to protest what they thought were both recruiting abuses and to protest, of course, the Iraq War. So DHS contacts the Maryland State Police to say there's going to be a demonstration on such and such a date. And then Maryland State Police opens a file on the group with respect to that protest, which of course was perfectly peaceful, completely protected by the First Amendment. The question is, how did DHS come to know that DAWN was going to have this protest? Under what authority did they get that information? Under what authority did they share that information with the MSP? And why did they share it with the MSP? If, as they have now publicly said, their purpose was simply to give a heads up to another law enforcement agency, why would they share it with MSP, which is not the local law enforcement agency in Silver Spring? Presumably, they would share it with the Montgomery County Police Department, which is the local law enforcement agency. But that isn't who they shared it with. They shared it with the Maryland State Police, which implies a level of knowledge on their part that Maryland State Police is compiling these dossiers. So that's very troubling. And of course, there isn't any legitimate reason why DHS would have had this information in the first place, collected the information, nor was there any authority for them to then transmit the information to MSP as they did.
Let's talk a little bit about what the various legislative proposals are in Maryland for getting a handle on this. The governor has one, Senator Jamie Raskin, another host on this program, and Delegate Sheila Hickson have another. Explain what these bills are.
Well, there are two competing bills, each of which has been introduced both in the House and in the Senate. So there's a total of 4 bills, but it's basically 2 bills in each house. And the bill that's been introduced by Senator Raskin and Delegate Hickson tracks very closely the findings and recommendation of the report that former State Attorney General and former U.S. Attorney Stephen Sachs did about the spying that we revealed through our Public Information Act requests. And the Raskin-Hickson bill incorporates that federal regulatory standard that I referred to earlier in requiring that before the police open an investigation of a political protest group or conduct a covert infiltration of a political protest group, there has to be reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal behavior. The bill also does something else that's very important, which sets up a set of procedural requirements to ensure that investigations of this type are approved at the highest level within the police department, so that you can't have lower level supervisors doing things without the chief of the department knowing about it. And sets up regular review and evidentiary justifications that the line supervisors, that the officers have to make in order to continue any investigation. And it also sets up review of information that's entered into criminal intelligence databases and review prior to that information being transmitted to any other entity.
Governor O'Malley has a different perspective. And he argues that the bill that Senator Raskin and Delegate Hickson they're proposing in both houses would deprive the state police or any police agency operating in the state from the ability to, for instance, enter in plain clothes into some kind of protest just to see what's going on, and also in order to ensure that some visiting dignitary isn't threatened, right?
Yeah, that argument did come up at the bill hearings, and I think it's really just a gross misreading of the bill. The Hickson-Raskin bill places limits only on police investigations and police collection of information into police databases. It has no bearing whatsoever on other law enforcement activities like crowd control at a demonstration, as long as they're not using that as a subterfuge to collect information, which we know the state police did from the documents that we have, where they would go to a demonstration, pose as an activist, and start interviewing other activists as a way of insinuating themselves into other groups. But as long as they're not doing that, which they shouldn't be doing, and are there just for crowd control, then the bill has, the Raskin-Hickson bill has no applicability. So that's really a red herring. The problem with the governor's bill is that it doesn't apply statewide, although they admitted at the hearing that it should apply statewide. It doesn't have any of these procedural requirements that I talked about. And most importantly, it doesn't have the substantive protection that the Raskin-Hickson bill does, in that it doesn't set forth a substantive standard prior to opening these investigations. Instead, the governor's bill focuses on motive. So it says it restricts the state police from conducting investigations for the purpose of harassing people from exercising their First Amendment rights. Well, of course, the state police shouldn't conduct investigations for that purpose.
And from what you said before, it's quite possible that the activity of the Maryland State Police that's already happened would not fall within the rubric of the governor's proposal.
Right. He's taking a page out of, frankly, the Bush playbook and retroactively providing legal cover for all the bad things that they did. I mean, it's certainly true that they shouldn't have that bad purpose, but trying to restrict their behavior by restricting bad motive doesn't actually restrict any of the bad things that they did. I don't think they had bad motive.
We're running out of time, so if people want to chime in on this issue, how do they get in touch?
Well, it's a critically important time because the committees are now considering these two bills. So the time to weigh in is right now and everyone should contact their representative, but most importantly, they should contact the governor. That's the critical thing, and they should tell the governor that they want strong protections that are found in the Raskin-Hickson bill, and they should contact the members of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee and the House Judiciary Committee. That's the critical thing.
Well, many thanks to David Rocah of the Maryland ACLU for your insights into the surveillance by the Maryland State Police of protest groups and the various legislative fixes on the table. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
You'll need a talk, an oral walk, something natural and recognizable by your folk, something of music, something of meaning, a style capable of running off at the mouth when massa, am, euro, Brit, lit irks you most, a little something something of ancestry, and the courage not to accept any award that helps you and hurts others. You'll need saturation, your own profanity of Sundays, breakfast and black fist. Wherever there is living, you must listen for the if and when the vernacular gives birth again. You'll need more than reference, coulda, woulda, shoulda, and more than edumacation. You may even need to sell you and buy you, so low, so long, sold, or to slant yourself into a container whose symbolism is unknowingly superior to standard usage. A brilliant attitude loved by good.
Welcome to WorkLife at the Coffee House. Immigration policy and enforcement is yet another big issue facing President Obama. In the last years of the Bush administration, there was an increase in aggressive workplace raids targeting immigrant workers. In addition, local law enforcement officials were encouraged to pursue more enforcement action directed at immigrants. Do we know anything yet about how President Obama will address the concerns that many have had with these Bush enforcement priorities? I am pleased that Michelle Mendez is with us today. Michelle is an attorney with CASA of Maryland and has been involved in challenging some of the recent workplace raids. Thank you for joining us at the Coffee House today, Michelle.
Thank you, Fred.
So what did change in the last year of the Bush administration in regard to enforcing immigration law?
Right, as you stated, we saw an upsurge in workplace raids, also in home raids, and then also an increase in 287G agreements, which are agreements that allow local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration laws.
So local law enforcement took up the task of enforcing what's essentially a federal policy. Is that it? And that wasn't really taking place prior to that time? That's correct.
It wasn't. It was a relatively new. It was a relatively new program, and it was one that really began in 2002 to be used in such frequency as we see now, and then it continued to increase from then on.
Mm-hmm. I know that comprehensive immigration reform legislation was being actively considered in 2006, 2007, and some suggest that after that went down, there was a change in immigration enforcement, the approach to enforcement. Does that roughly coincide with when these increases took place?
I see that it's accurate.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I mean, they were essentially, in both cases, these workplace raids and the local officials being more actively involved, they were enforcing immigration law. So what's the problem with that? What problem do people have with simply enforcing the law as it is?
Sure. Well, if we want to, as some people say, just start enforcing immigration laws and trying to deport the over 12 million people that we have here without documentation, you have to think of all the manpower. You have to think of financially what that's going to take. In our economic times, we really can't even fathom going down that route. And then what really, that's not the answer to this. It's humane immigration reform first, or along with enforcement of the laws. And then if we are going to enforce the laws, it is best to really focus on those people that should not be here, the criminals, if you will, the violent criminals, not the people that are here trying to feed their families, that are out in the park with their families, that are just really trying to contribute to our society.
Okay, in the workplace raids, what went on in those kind of raids? I know you've been involved with some of that litigation. What kind of laws were involved, and what kind of actions were taking place?
You mean by the ICE agents themselves?
Yeah.
Sure. So in about at least 9 states have seen raids to a really large scale affecting hundreds of people, or to a smaller scale affecting about 50 or so people. And you really saw a lot of constitutional law violations, a lot of Fourth Amendment violations to be exact. You saw ultimately the separation of families. The DHS, which is Department of Homeland Security, put out a statistic not too long ago that between the years of 1997 and 2008, 100,000 individuals who had been deported during that period had children who were U.S. citizens. So you saw not just the violation of rights as they enforced the laws, but then the aftermath, the effect on the family unit is really antithetical to the American way.
Isn't it also true that in some of these raids, it wasn't only immigration issues, but also workplace issues? And what happened in regard to that? And why shouldn't they be enforcing those kinds of laws?
You're exactly right, Fred. So what happened there, though, during the Bush years, and something that Obama, which we'll get to, I know, has committed to, is Obama is committed to looking at the employer side. Previously, what we've seen up until now is really a focus on the employee. So you're looking at the supply side of economics and not the demand. And so you've got a lot of individuals who are picked up at these workplace raids. The employers are pretty much, a lot of them are just let go, even though they have broken the law themselves. And then something else that we do, or that we try to do in our holistic litigation approach, is to make sure that those individuals who oftentimes aren't even paid minimum wage do get their wages at the end of the day. And so that's part of the larger litigation process too. So
you mentioned not getting paid. What other kinds of workplace violations were involved in some of these raids? There are so many, but the really egregious ones, I can talk about individuals who have been sexually harassed. That's all over the nation. People whose Fourth Amendment rights have been violated. We've seen a couple of home raids also in various states where people are woken up pre-dawn with their families. The ICE agents knocking on the door with weapons or just burst through, oftentimes without warrants. They're now just trying to get around and getting the warrants, but previously if you can imagine the fear that your family goes through when you've got people just barging through your door with weapons and accusing you of being a criminal or treating you as such, and you're not even that. You're here, and let me remind everybody that because you're here without lawful status doesn't mean that you're a criminal. It's a violation of civil immigration laws. Do we know anything about the targeting? I mean, how did they choose what workplaces to raid? I mean, was there some? You mentioned warrants in terms of the home raids, but now in the workplace raids, did they just randomly raid any workplace? What workplaces did they raid?
Sure. Well, the one that really comes to mind is the Postville, Iowa raid, and there were about 300 plus individuals who were taken in on that raid. But like most things, you need consent or you need a warrant. So with a work enforcement raid, you really could just get the consent of the employer if it's not a public place, if it's a private workplace. So that one in particular, like I said, it affected 300 and some individuals. And then you've got one in New Bedford, also almost 2 years ago as well, 300 and some people were also taken in. And then really sad story about that is that a woman, a nursing mother, was picked up as part of that raid, and her 7-month-old infant had to go into the hospital because a U.S. citizen, may I add, her mom was in detention and would not be let out on humanitarian release for a couple of days and had to be hospitalized.
So these were the places of these raids tended to have large immigrant workforces. That
Right.
seems to be one of the things
Right.
that characterize them.
Correct.
And you mentioned the Iowa raid. I do think there were some pretty serious workplace violations there. What happened in regard to those?
Sure, I'm not the expert on that raid, but as most immigrant rights advocates know, a lot of the people were charged or being told, accept this plea bargain for fraud, for using Social Security number incorrectly, which is actually a case now that the Supreme Court has heard recently and is going to rule on. But they were told, just take this plea bargain and then you can leave sooner than later. So you saw a lot of Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment violations in that raid in particular.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've also heard about, and you mentioned the deputizing of local officials to enforce immigration law. What's wrong with that? I mean, why shouldn't local officials be enforcing immigration law?
Sure, I think Montgomery County Police Chief Thomas Manger said it best recently at the House Committee on Homeland Security when he said that the public safety really is increased when you have confidence and trust in your local law enforcement. And that really highlights why it's such a bad idea to deputize local law enforcement agents, because you want your community to feel safe with your local law enforcement. You want them to come forth and tell the local agents about any criminal activity that's going on in their neighborhoods if they have been the victims of crimes. So you really want them to come forward. And then as far as the 287G agreements and how they are...
Now, the 287G, that's the part of the law that allows the federal government to deputize the locals.
That's correct, exactly. That's the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that says that they can do that. It's a voluntary agreement. But so under these programs, under these agreements, we in the immigrants' rights community, immigrant advocates community, we've heard a lot of allegations of civil rights violations. Racial profiling is a big one. Recently, when we had the committee hearing for DHS, House Committee hearing DHS.
These were congressional hearings
exactly.
that just happened recently.
Exactly, yeah. And the reason they had it was because they had heard so many allegations of racial profiling, and it's a controversial program. And the Government Accountability Office, GAO, issued a report on 287G agreements. They studied a few of them, not all of them, but a good amount of them, and they saw that these programs really lack supervision and really lack control. So to call them a success, as some of the sheriffs want to call them, Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona for one, is really, you can't even get that far because there's no way to document these, and has been very little supervision.
So you mentioned Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona. I know we've heard there have been stories of him. What's been the problem with him? I mean, he's the sheriff doing his job, no?
He's, in my opinion, obviously no, he is not doing his job. His job is to, as Chief Thomas Manger would say here in Montgomery County, his job would be to further the public safety. And if anything, he's really just terrorized a lot of the immigrant community in Arizona. There have been multiple editorials too, I might add, in Arizona from the Tucson Citizen, the Arizona Republic, saying how this has really been a negative.
What are some of the things he's done?
So the things he's done recently, he has paraded his 287G detainees through moving them from one cell openly, one cell to the other, and has invited the media to come see them in a very dehumanized way, in their jail get-ups, in their shackles. That's one of the controversial things. But he has had also multiple lawsuits filed against him by the ACLU down in Arizona. Recently, to be on the timely end of things, he's actually mentioned that he will no longer participate in the 287G agreement if there's going to be stricter controls by the Department of Homeland Security, as they have recently vowed to look into, given the committee hearing.
Okay, so now take us to today in the Obama administration. I know there was one raid in Bellingham, Washington, that caused a bit of a stir. Tell us what happened there in terms of what was the administration's involvement with that?
Sure. It came as quite a shock to the immigrant advocacy community. We had, and we still have, great expectations, but unfortunately over 24 individuals were taken in this raid. It's a family-owned business, car repair. And apparently, Janet Napolitano, Secretary Napolitano, didn't even know that this raid had occurred, and on the bright side has decided that she's going and issued a statement that she's going to look really closely into the actions of the ICE agents in that raid.
So we do have some indications that the new administration is taking a careful look at all of this. And in your view, what are some of the kinds of things that the new administration should be most mindful of in enforcing immigration law?
Sure. I think that if they're going to enforce immigration law, I think that it should be coupled with comprehensive immigration reform, or have comprehensive immigration reform come first and then enforcement. I don't think you can just go on an enforcement-only system, because we've seen the terrible repercussions of an enforcement-only system for the past years, and the havoc that it's wreaked on communities, not just the immigrant community, but like small cities, for example, that really rely on immigrant labor. So that, for one, definitely a closer look at the 287G agreements and refocus it on violent criminals, or really just move away from 287G if possible, because that again is against public interest.
Right. Well, thanks. Thanks, Michelle, for your insights into the enforcement of immigration law today. Our immigration system remains broken, and there is a great need for comprehensive reform. But until that happens, the Obama administration faces the important challenge of developing enforcement policies that are humane and sensitive to the needs of our immigrant communities. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been WorkLife.
He carves hair like wood, pressing rough fingers into the clipper's thrumming body. Out there, he weaves lacework out of nanmu, the way the communists trained him. In here, the linoleum worn to a pallid sheen, they eat, Suzhou dialect sloping like pagoda roofs, rises above the humming fluorescence. Their safe haven, ensconced in sweet steam from 2 rice cookers, big and round barrels. They dip serving paddles into the rice, its give easy, not like nanmu, like love. To the woodworker, the men's hair falls from the blade easy as twigs in winter. One after another, the men slide into the folding chair. He shakes off the drape and fastens it around another suntan neck. Black bristly heads are whittled down with arcing clean lines. He takes care not to nick ears or leave sideburns uneven. Symmetry, he knows. The men say little to him. Next season, they will all be doing this again as another garden rises in another city. At the end of lunch, they sweep up tufts of black hair with stray grains of white rice.
Hi, and welcome to a second look at the Coffee House. Now that the American taxpayers, that would be us, have invested many billions of dollars to rescue the major banks, are we now entitled to expect those same banks to operate in the public interest? Actually, let me put it another way, since not all of us probably agree on what is exactly in the public interest. But let's say the banks hold the deeds to thousands of vacant houses that are deteriorating and lowering the value of surrounding neighborhoods. Should the banks fix up these houses for resale? Should they tear them down? Or should they just hang on to them and hope that there will be a new sweet deal from the federal government? Actually, that would be our money again. A new sweet deal to take those houses off their hands. Those are the questions that Mary Kane tackles in a recent report in the Washington Independent, and she's in the studio to tackle them once again. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe you can explain a little better than I just did. What really is the problem here?
Well, you know, since we've had to start bailing out banks, there's been a lot of attention to bank misdeeds like, you know, executive pay, bonuses, lavish outings. But the one thing that hasn't gotten the attention it really should is the number of bank-owned properties that are scarring neighborhoods around the country. These properties are known as REOs, or real estate-owned houses. And what happens is when a bank forecloses on a house, the next step in the foreclosure process is usually a foreclosure auction or a sheriff's sale. In markets where the houses are still selling, people will buy those houses. But in weaker markets, Detroit, Cleveland, urban areas in the urban Northeast, in the Rust Belt, and in the outer far exurbs in Arizona, California, some of the bubble markets, the houses aren't worth much. They don't sell, and the banks just take them back. And that's where the problem starts. The whole system is clogged. Banks have too many of these, and they're letting a lot of them.
How many are you talking about here?
Well, the projections are for 3 million foreclosures this year and 1.5 million REOs. In a normal year, banks only have about 160,000 REOs on their books.
So 10 times as many as normal.
10 times. And some banks do hire property management companies and keep those properties up until they can sell them again, but many banks do not, and that's where the problem is. So neighborhoods get totally scarred by a vacant, vandalized house, drags down everybody's property values. The banks don't pay taxes on these houses sometimes, don't fix them up.
Oh, that's interesting, that they get away with not paying taxes?
Yes, people don't realize there are bank walkaways where a bank might send a foreclosure notice, a borrower leaves the house, as you would if you got a foreclosure notice, but the bank decides it's not worth it to follow through. And so they never actually foreclose on the house, and it sits in limbo. It's called a toxic title, where a borrower doesn't realize they may still be held responsible for the upkeep of the house. The bank walks away. It's an out-of-state bank. Housing courts can't get the bank into court to clean it, order it to clean it up, and the community is stuck with the house.
So no one has control or responsibility?
No.
Isn't there some general incentive for the banks to, I mean, they own these properties for the most part, right? And to do something with them?
You would think, but a couple things are going on. First, the system is totally overwhelmed. The whole foreclosure pipeline is sort of choked. REOs you can think of as the back end. The actual foreclosure is the front end. The REOs are the back end. And there's too many foreclosures in the pipeline, too many REOs in the pipeline, and many more to come. And so what's happening is sometimes real estate agents aren't even putting these REOs on the market because the prices are so low for them that they're holding back, hoping that the market will improve. In other cases, some of the banks are hanging on to these because they still hold out hope. There'll be, there's been a lot of talk of a bad bank to buy up, toxic assets on banks' books, and they're holding out and hoping that these houses will get picked up. And in other cases, they've just decided it's not worth it. To foreclose in Detroit, you get no value back from foreclosing. It costs a bank to foreclose. It's negative 10% when they foreclose in Detroit. So it costs them money to follow through on this. So they just sit on the distressed properties.
All right. I want to get back to this, but let me back up for just a second, because all of a sudden, you know, that we're in this crisis, right? To say the least. And so, yeah, things are generally 10 times worse than they should be.
That's a good way to put it.
And the banks are suffering, you know, at least in theory, just as much as everyone else. They're struggling. They may not survive, some of them, right? So how did we get to this point?
Well, a good way to look at that is that, you know, before the bubble market from 2005 to 2007 or so, there was a lot of what we call predatory lending going on, subprime lending. And, you know, subprime loans were not sold the way regular loans were sold. It was a different market. It was risk-based pricing. So a borrower went in not knowing what their interest rate might be on the loan. They didn't find out until they formally applied. If they looked at their application and saw that the credit or that the interest rate might be exploding in a few years, their broker assured them that housing prices would only rise and they could refinance out of it. So you had a lot of problems with the loan products themselves in the subprime market, but they were making a lot of money as long as house prices were going up.
Right. So, I mean, they made their commissions and they made the interest money.
Right.
And it was all based on endless inflation?
Endless house prices going up.
Right.
Then what happened, you moved into things like all-day loans, what we call liar's loans. And those were initially really a niche product that were only aimed at people who had fluctuating incomes, like a doctor right out of medical school who had student loan debts but whose income would rise. But what happened was, like, a company like Countrywide cannibalized the alt-day loans, sold them to the masses. And the pay option arms you hear about where you could choose your monthly payment, they were never intended to be sold to everyone or for everyone to only pay the interest on it. It was a niche product to be used only in certain cases and only to miss maybe a month or two. And so the loan products were sold in such a way that made them risky. And they were sold as affordability products. The only way you could afford a house because prices were going up so much was to engage in these kind of exotic loans.
Well, if I was a loan officer doing this, or certainly a general manager of a bank, wouldn't I have paused at some point and thought, this is really going to catch up to me?
It wouldn't catch up to you because you sold it to Wall Street, and they packaged it and bundled it and sold it to a million other investors.
And they really thought that that would get rid of
Yeah. The idea was that risk was a whole different thing because it had been sliced and diced and sold around the globe. And so if the loan went bad initially, it actually never came back to the mortgage broker, or, you know, it had gone up the line so far that the people at the end of the line never really saw the damage being done back at the beginning of the process.
So something of a shell game, in effect.
It is. We now understand that no matter how you slice and dice risk, a bad loan is a bad loan.
Right.
But that was not the belief at the time.
Right. So, okay, so now we have all of these houses, and so if I'm living next to one of these vacant houses, I'm going to watch it, what's going to happen to it.
Right, but you're powerless, and that's part of the problem, is that you don't really know who, maybe you might not be able to figure out who owned it because, again, these products were securitized and sold around the globe, so it's not always clear who even owns the house. The servicer sometimes can't tell you who the lender is. You can't contact them. There are people trying to compile REO databases, but they're all not always listed as such, and so communities are kind of stuck with these houses and with not a lot of power to do something about it.
So is there a way, if I'm powerless as the neighbor, is there a way that my city council, my state legislature can do something?
Well, I think people are really looking more to the federal government because the problem is so huge. And one of the disappointments with the Obama administration's housing plan is that while it addressed the foreclosure issue, it didn't address the REO issue. Nothing has so far. And so there is a cry to say, hey, listen, if we're going to give banks more bailout money, let's attach some conditions to it about how they handle the REOs, that they have to pay their property taxes, that they have to be responsible for this house from the time it enters the REO process until it leaves it. New Jersey is one of the first states to enact such a law. It goes into effect April 1st. But the problem, the magnitude is so huge that there's a call for a federal response for the Federal Reserve in particular to crack down on banks and say, if you're going to take money from the government, you have to take care of your REO inventories. They've really been neglected.
Does it make some sense? I mean, we have excess housing, I guess. Does it make sense just to bulldoze some of these, turn the land into parks?
Yeah, in some, in some areas that are really devastated in Cleveland and Detroit, houses sell for so little, and now they're just being sold to speculators, and it's a game, selling it over the internet and while people might think that's sort of interesting or maybe something to dabble in, you're talking about people's lives and their neighborhoods. It's not just a piece of paper to them. And so it would be great, I think people are trying to have communities have more control over what happens to these properties if banks really don't want them, with community development corporations getting control of them, maybe a national land bank, some way that communities can have some control over these properties.
So if they become community properties, then what would the plan be?
You can redevelop them into affordable rental housing. If they need to be torn down, the communities can tear them down, create green space, parks, any kind of use that's good for the community instead of just sitting there tearing down everybody's property values.
In the houses that actually do sell for $7,500 or for even, I guess, $5, I know I read these stories.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? I mean, is somebody going to flip these and make money?
Yes, for some reason, investors are interested in this.
Yes.
And I'm using the word investors loosely because I assume it's just people who are messing around on eBay and think it might be fun to own a few houses in Cleveland or Detroit or something. And they do try to flip them. Sometimes they rent them.
Okay.
They rent them out, but that's repairs and things like that. Some people think they can make money off it. Some just quickly flip it to another. Mainly, it usually gets quickly flipped to another speculator. If they can't make money right away, they let it sit there, and it's really a vicious cycle. It's called the death spiral.
And I assume, because the house just continues to deteriorate.
And it's worse. And by the time it goes through REO again and again, its value is so little, it's not worth it. And it's an insult to the community to have these out of state and sometimes out of the country speculators playing games over the internet with these properties that are devastating people's lives.
So, as you said, it really is a federal, or we need the feds to get involved in this.
The scope of the problem is huge. People haven't seen that, And a federal land bank, I'm not clear how you could work that out, but that's one idea that's being floated. But the biggest first response would be really to tie conditions to any money that banks get, just like we've done for other bank misdeeds, and say, listen, you need to take care of your properties or you can't get money from the government.
And okay, so that's sort of a negative. I mean, that's the hammer. What would the carrot be here?
Well, there's an idea for more sort of creative rental policies. Maybe we have something that can work out before these houses end up empty and vacant, where homeowners who are stuck in them, maybe they can get a sort of get out of jail free card where they give the house back to the bank that they can't sell and they can't afford, and the bank clears their credit record so they can get some decent rental housing or save again and be able to buy in the future. And so there's some ideas being kicked around that way.
Right. I mean, the banks historically have always fought every federal involvement in their business. Are they willing now to?
I don't think they have much choice anymore, especially because, like I said, this problem on the back end has become so huge that it's really devastating for some communities that there has to be a sort of coordinated response.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks to Mary Kane for both for her investigative report in the Washington Independent and for this thought-provoking discussion. We can only hope that some bank officials will take to heart that it's a new era and they need new policies, especially since they have new financial partners. That would be us. I'm Howard Cohen, and this has been A Second Look.
Once again I'm stepping up to the plate. Strike one. I can't remember what I had to do today. Right on. I think I'll make an iced tea and ponder, is something in it for me? I wonder on the front porch, nobody knows I'm a little down. On the front porch, sitting counting the cars heading into town. 'Cause it's a catbird seed by the side of the road. I'm gonna wave to people I might never know and let the sun shine on my feet on the front porch. She had to know absolutely where she stood with me. I told her that she's getting everything that's good for free. She jumped right out of her chair and hollered, come on, Daddy, play fair and give me $10 on the front porch. Nobody knows you're a little down on the front porch, sitting counting the cars heading into town. 'Cause it's a catbird seed by the side of the road. You're gonna wave to people you might never know. Let the sun shine on your feet on the front porch. I think I'll make an iced tea and I'll ponder, is something in it for me? I wonder. On the front porch, nobody knows I'm a little down. On the front porch, sitting counting the cars heading into town. 'Cause it's a catbird seed by the side of the road. I'm gonna wave to people I might never know. Let the sun shine on my feet on the front porch. 'Cause it's a catbird seed by the side of the road. I wave goodbye to people I might never know. And let the sun shine on my feet on the front porch.
Let me just walk right up at the end of the song. Welcome, John Carroll. Welcome, Ben Carroll. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure for us.
I've got to remember to run up at the end of the song instead of applauding, going, oh, wait a minute, I got to do an interview.
Yeah, right. And I'll put on the other guitar while we're talking.
All right, good. We'll make it smooth. So, Ben.
Yes, sir.
We will make it clear to the audience that this is father and son. And this has been going on for a while. Not the father and son part, but obviously the playing of music together. You're living where now?
I live in Brooklyn, New York.
Okay. And let's see, you have an album out called The Real Thing.
Real Thing is my recent and second release under my own name.
But you're used to the travel probably because of this guy, right?
Yeah, I grew up, with a musical family, with a lot of music at home, and then traveling with Dad when he was on tour. Which
when you first traveled, you traveled as his son, not as a fellow musician, right?
Right.
It's just like, oh yeah, I got my son coming along, and yeah, he'll help.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. What's the name of this one you're going out with?
This is sort of our ode to Sam and Dave and that sort of duo.
Stax Volt.
Stax Volt, singing about love type of thing. It's called Just Relax.
Okay, take us home.
2, 3, 4. Girl, why you wanna be wary of me? Don't think you're barking up the do me wrong tree. I'm not your downfall, baby. Try to relax, baby. 'Cause there's a big, wide, wonderful world to see. Kissing is a glimpse of where I want us both to be. So don't be scared, no, baby. Just relax, Something's got you stirring, you don't know what it is. You're pouting, not purring, and it ain't nobody's business. It's a shame to be taming what's wild and what's true. It's a crime to be hiding when it's coming after you. Oh, girl, I ain't asking you to marry me, but I got the feeling this is where you wanna be. So don't be scared, no, baby, just relax. Yeah. got a tree complete, but you won't let me see. You got a panic reaction to unnatural chemistry. Keeps on bubbling up, you keep on covering the cup. Let it go, let it flow, let your feelings start to show. Oh, girl, I ain't asking you to be my slave. I don't need no nanny, no granny, no little orphan, and I don't want to be saved, no. Baby, try to relax, baby. I'll try to behave now. Baby, just relax. Well,